For the most part, I really liked what the developers have showcased so far from the Gothic 1 remake. But when the day comes that the remake releases, and if it is successful, it will probably set in stone a new blueprint for any further potential Gothic games going forward. And this has me somewhat worried, because I feel like there is one aspect of the original game that is slowly being lost, and may never come back. But to really understand the point that I'll be laying out for you, we need to travel back a few years to a time that was very influential for the overall design philosophy and thinking that shaped Gothic and its art direction. It's 1997. The whole gaming industry is still in its infancy to some degree, and not nearly as professionalized and streamlined as today. An ambitious artist just made the daring decision to quit his old job in the 2D animation industry to make his dream come true of becoming a self-employed freelance concept artist. And to get his first clients, he makes various phone calls to local companies in the city that he hopes to work with. One of them is a freshly founded tiny game studio run by only 4 guys out of a small office room which was located in a building that was previously a hair salon. That studio was Piranha Bytes, and he got the job. Over the next months, Ralph worked very closely with Mike himself to develop a lot of the concept art for Gothic 1. And through his direct influence this early in the development, he ends up defining a large portion of the aesthetics and characteristics of the world we all fell in love with. He later on even designed the cover art and the logo design for Gothic 1, which was so long ago that he was using Photoshop version 3 apparently. And there's this really interesting thing you can find in old podcast appearances from Ralph, where he talks about these early days at Piranha Bytes, because one of the aspects that he talks very passionately about is his interest and the inspiration he took from art history and paintings from the 18th century. And I think this influence that he talks about really shows the game just has this really unique and special art style and design philosophy, where not only the muted colors, but also the vistas and viewpoints, the painterly sunsets, and the old ruins and the decaying buildings give you the feeling of looking at an old painting from the 18th century. Both transport this special kind of slightly melancholic and almost lonely feeling, with this sort of romanticized view of nature and abandoned historic buildings. And I think a large part of what makes Gothic 1 so special, its atmosphere and art style, comes from how it draws on art history and how it tries to replicate this certain aesthetic. You can also see this approach reflected in the 2 prominent Gothic paintings that are used in-game of the Ore Baron fighting the Harpies or posing in the throne room. But Gothic 1 seems not only heavily inspired by art history, it also seems to include a fairly vast and diverse set of historic and cultural references, which are much more exotic and uncommon than what one might expect from a typical European medieval setting. For example, there are the rice fields built in typical Asian fashion across multiple terraces. Then there's the giant cave of the new camp that seems to be directly inspired by ancestral Puebloans, and the housing they built in caves in the American Southwest. The references for the sect camp are hard to pinpoint exactly, but for me personally, I'm always reminded of Buddhist monks or other Asian or Indian cultures. And then there's the old camp marketplace, which is inspired by Middle Eastern cultures and their depictions in Orientalist artworks. But here is why I'm worried that something is being lost. Gothic 1 had an extremely unique aesthetic that was built from the combination of historical artworks, real-life cultural inspirations, and the unique design implementation of the artists. But some of the elements that have been redesigned and reimagined in the remake seem to be leaning much more on typical fantasy game tropes and art styles, making it feel like they're leaning much less on art history and much more on gaming history instead. More specifically, one of the biggest and most well-recognized brands in the fantasy RPG adjacent genre, World of Warcraft. One example is this new orc design, which has these massive metal spikes on the shoulder armor, which I think feels much more at home in the Warcraft universe than in the Gothic universe. Another example is the hooded statues that have been added to the redesign of the Troll Canyon, which also reminded me a lot of Blizzard's art style. And then there's also the general amount of spikes that have been added all over the place, which for me feel a bit like they came straight out of the Warcraft universe as well. Now combine that with the fact that we also went from the brownish fur of the original orcs to the now green skin of the remake, and I feel like we traded a lot of unique and original style for something that feels kind of generic and like it's trying to imitate the biggest names in the genre, namely Blizzard Entertainment. The thing though is, I guess, no matter how much I like this old approach from the original Gothic, no one can deny the worldwide gigantic success of games that opt for this more modern art style that is prevalent throughout World of Warcraft and other modern games. And it's also happening with other remake games that are in the making, like with Heroes 3 for example, where we go from an art style that is clearly influenced by art history and old paintings, to something that is influenced by the art styles most successful the last couple of years in the game industry. So maybe this switch is the right thing to do to open it up to more of a mass market, and it's a bit of a calculated move? Or maybe the reason is not that complicated at all, and it just comes down to the developers and artists at Alkimia personally preferring this new style more? In any case, I don't want the takeaway of this video to come across as me proclaiming that my personal preference is the only correct way to approach a remake of Gothic. A lot of what people like more in this regard comes down to personal preference anyways, at the end of the day. But overall, I just can't help but feel a bit sad and nostalgic that going forward from here, the design approach that defined and influenced the very first Gothic game maybe the most, might never come back to the Gothic franchise quite in the way that it was present back in the day. All criticism and personal preference in terms of art style aside though, I have to say running around out of bounds in the recent demo has gotten me super hyped for the remake. I really can't wait to explore this gorgeous looking world once the game comes out. So don't forget to subscribe if you want to stick around for more Gothic content on this channel in the future.